Welcome to Thesen am Tresen, the still logistics talk. And this is your host for today, journalist and founder of the Logistics Hall of Fame, Anita Würmser.
Thesen am Tresen. Willkommen.
Thesen am Tresen. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 14th floor of our studio at InterContinental Berlin, and welcome to all of you streaming live from your screens. We are having a premiere today of our Thesen am Tresen talks. Our guests here today are Christine Mezger-Behan, she's Vice President of the Logistics System of Kion Group in Aschaffenburg, Ralf Düster, the Chairman of Settler Holding in Bochum and New York, and Harald Seifert, Chairman of the Advisory Board of the Seifert Logistics Group. Welcome to our over-the-counter talks here. Our topic today is globalization, and we're discussing the very interesting question of whether we can make do without China and how the corona crisis has changed the value chain. Do we have to react, and how can we react? And to make sure that we're not going thirsty here, we've got some Indian tea here for you, very globalized tea coming to you from India. Let me offer you something to drink. So when it comes to drinks, I think we're seeing globalization here already. We've got coffee, we've got wine, we've got tea, and we may not even be aware of how globalized the beverages are that we're having. What can we do without microchips or coffee? Well, I'm a coffee drinker. For me, it's easy. I never drink coffee, so I can definitely do without coffee, and I care much more about the industry and about microchips. This is important to so many industries. Of course, this question is a bit unfair because no matter how you answer it, basically it's answered itself. Globalization has no alternative, but it's not quite that simple, is it? And I think our guests have come up with a few theses that we want to discuss. Let's get started with Chris Mezger-Behan. The Brits, we have heard, have kind of turned in on themselves, but Chris has been born in the UK. She has studied in London, and you've been to Germany since 1992, and you have recently become a German citizen. From a logistical viewpoint, you're definitely a citizen of the world. When it comes to supply chains, you know your stuff. We have come up with a supply chain strategy for the e-bikes at Bosch, I think. And what's also important to know is that your business is globalized. By 95%, your bikes are being produced in Taiwan. And you've also received a very renowned award last year. And 2020, you have joined Kion in order to design the supply chain there. And your thesis that you've come up with for today is that globalization is not the problem, but the solution. Can you go into detail about that? Well, of course, this is a bit provocative as a thesis, but you've mentioned it at the beginning. I'm originally from the UK, and I have seen it in recent developments, what it means when countries kind of put up borders and don't interact with others anymore. And I don't think that makes a lot of sense. I think we have to remain open, and we can benefit from this. You mentioned it at the beginning. We've got Indian tea here. This is a sign of globalization. So we all benefit from it. And I still think that we will all benefit from globalization at some point. But the trend is kind of going the other way, don't you think? We've seen it during the pandemic, how Corona has changed all of this, when it came to masks, and now we've got the microchip crisis. And another fact is that 94% of all businesses have got huge impairments when it comes to their supply chains because of the pandemic. And I wondered, and I think that's something that we've also been discussing in magazines, is Corona the beginning of the end of globalization? This is something that we've seen in the media, especially in expert media, but now also the general media is reporting about it. What do you think? Well, yes, that's where my thesis comes in. I think it comes down to the truth being somewhere in the middle. But I do think that Corona has been a huge lesson for all of us, still is really. Some say that that Corona is past us, but I don't think we're quite past it yet. So we have to learn from this experience. And I do think, I'm convinced that we can only do this together, no matter where we are in the world. And I also think that at the end of the day, we have to be aware of where our resources come from, because of course there are things that are contained in our products that of course are not from here in Germany or from Europe. So we must think about how we can work with these supply chains. How can these goods come here? How can we work together to make this happen? Another thing that I think is important is that, while we're talking about it, and of course I'm also reading the news and the magazines, this is not something that's going to happen overnight. I think we can all agree on that. May I just add something to what Chris just said? I also think that we cannot stop globalization. Adam Smith said the larger the market is, the larger wealth is for everyone. And I do agree with that. I think that applies to the selling process where we are trying to create markets and sell, but also in purchasing and procurement, because the better we're doing there in a globalized world, the bigger are our chances of also producing products in a competitive way. We are living in a global world, and it's a very complex structure. So therefore, we have global competitors, and we have to adapt to that. But of course, the danger here is that we start depending on certain markets or states, and that's where it gets a bit difficult, wouldn't you think? Because if we try to adapt to that, and then certain markets or states just say, no, you can't have our stuff anymore, then I think we're kind of in a pickle. So we have to have a more targeted approach to this and look at, what are the most important resources we can actually also produce within Europe or within a certain market, and then make sure that a certain share of the supply chain is also international. Yes, I agree with it. And I think the targeted approach that you mentioned, that's the decisive factor here. And that, of course, requires transparency. How can our supply chains look like? What shares are where? And I think, Ralf, you're an absolute expert when it comes to that. But if we have that, if we have these supply chains separated over different markets and states, then I think we can work on the dimensions. And that's only possible if we trust each other. And that in turn brings me back to what I said originally. Protectionism isn't going to serve anyone. It's not useful for transparency, and then we'll just be lost. And I think you just brought us back to Ralf Düster and his theses, talking about transparency here. Ralf Düster, you said the following. You said, and you're someone who basically grew up with transparency and fashion, and this is not what you're thinking. We're still talking about globalization and supply chains here, but you have worked for decades in the textile industry. You worked for Steilman and set up the supply chains there, those to Asia as well. So basically, you were a personified mix between transparency and fashion, and then you founded your own software company in order to bring transparency to supply chains. And then, to create an IT system that can basically form a network. And that's, I think, very interesting. You said that we cannot yet make it without China, but we will destroy our company's futures if we don't think globally. And you also said that if we continue the way we did before the pandemic, then the globalization is going to bring us down. How can you go into detail about that? Well, we have to have transparent supply chains. We have to have this transparency. We have to be more collaborative with our suppliers, with our manufacturers, no matter where they are in the world. And when we come to the Supply Chain Act, the most recent coalition in Germany has brought this off the ground, this new law, and it was clear that the coalition wanted to really take a stand here when it comes to corporate social responsibility, which is yet another really important topic when it comes to global procurement processes. Mr. Altmaier, the business and economy minister, sort of softened this a little bit, this process, but we've heard it from Brussels as well. Brussels is trying to really focus for the next year on the fact that mid-term manufacturers and contractual partners have to be more transparent. And that makes it hard for the economy already, because they will be like, oh no, this is all very bureaucratic, there's so much administrative stuff to be done. But that's not necessarily the case if you do this with digitalization on your side, because what we've seen is that only a fifth of all businesses is really dealing with supply chains in the way of asking, how are we working in this process? Are they doing enough? I mean, you're an expert in the textile industry. Do you think that textile businesses are doing enough? Yes, there's a lot going on there. I think a good example is KickOn. I think we've had an interesting presentation here as well by the representative of Kick, because when the Rana Plaza broke down, I think 8 or 9 years ago, we've heard it, and people came up and they said, is this really true? Are we really responsible for this? And Kick then came up with a program and also had a tender running, and they have decided to go with our solution and have made all factories completely transparent regarding auditing, regarding salaries. In Bangladesh and Cambodia at the moment, where we've also got a lot of bicycles being manufactured, 40 to 60% actually of salary increases is what we've seen there because of these transparency renewals. So we have to take this responsibility, and digital processes make this really easy, and that's what we're working on. Talking about transparency, did you think, and this is regarding the corona crisis, that when it comes to purchasing, when it comes to warehouse locations, inventories, has anything changed there? Yes, definitely. A lot of the bicycle manufacturers who are producing in Asia have gone completely empty, because there was so much demand for cycling because nothing else could be done during lockdowns. And then the fashion and textile industry had a huge blockage because they weren't selling very much. So there was a big imbalance there. And what we've seen now with our customers and partners is that there is, the need to back this up. People want to go shopping again. And because all these goods are coming from the globalized world, they have to make sure that they meet these demands. Let me add something. I am, of course, for digitization, but, we've got the corona crisis. Everyone wants to buy a bicycle, and then your suppliers have to tell you, well, it's going to take 12 months for this bicycle to arrive. So that's the problem, I think. We can do whatever we want, but if we don't have the goods in our stores, the physical goods there, because of the pandemic, and then we've had this crazy situation that people were afraid that they would run out of toilet paper for, of course. So if the goods are not in the store, then we've got the problem right there. So where can we manufacture? Where can we produce to make sure that the warehouses remain stocked? Because that's, I think, where we need to see the changes. We have to make decisions on where do we produce which goods, where can we do temporary warehousing and stockages, because we were spoiled when it comes to globalization. We could, at the click of a button, we could have everything. And I do think that because of the pandemic, this is going to change. Well, I think this is two things you are talking about here. We've got the dimensioning of our supply chains. This is where we need transparency. And the other thing, and I'm also convinced of that, is that we, when it comes to regional supply chains, that we need to increase our inventories there. And I see that happening definitely. And this makes us happy because with our products, we can provide solutions for this at KION Group. But once we recover from this pandemic, I definitely think that we can focus on that. And the conclusion, I think, would have to be, if we work more with regional warehouses, is that we can reduce logistics cost. And I think now we've hit the bottom there, and then I think logistics costs will rise if we do things more regionally, because these things will be more expensive. And then citizens who want to order things at the click of a button, you know, no matter where they trigger the supply chain, they will think and they will realize that we'll all have to pay just a little bit more to make sure that this happens. And I do think that brings us to your thesis. Let me add another point here. You may in a bit, but now, of course, we need to introduce Harald Seifert, a businessman from Swabia. And the nice thing about your people is that you're not only successful, but you're also very pragmatic, and where others shy back, you become really active, and you're one of them. And your thesis is completely contrary to the others, because you say we have to make do without China. Production and supply chains have to be anchored more strongly in Europe, even though things might become more expensive because of that. And you already said things will get more expensive. How much more expensive do you think? Well, I'm not sure I can tell, but I just wanted to have a very provocative thesis, because in Germany we need a trade agreement with the US. That so much is clear. But we cannot be too dependent on China. They're ruling so much already, and they've structured so much. And now they're arriving at our ports, at Piraeus, for example, and even in Hamburg at the port we've seen them. And if they do this, if they can enter our markets there, then they will be able to change our supply chains, make them cheaper maybe. But that gives them an advantage in turn. So the problem that I see is in the automotive industry. Let's look at the microchip crisis and the huge disruptions we've seen because of this. In Taiwan, factories were just closed for 2 months because of the lockdowns. Does that make sense to bring microchip production back to Europe? Yes, definitely, because if we have billions of losses in the automotive industry, then we just have to come up with a solution here. We have to wonder how we can reduce lead times, how we can produce better, and we have to make sure that these chip factories come back to Germany, back to Europe. We cannot simply have products that we assemble here, but have to buy the parts from everywhere. Steel, for example, has become 40% more expensive. So I can make a decision: can I have warehouses without shelves, or do I make sure that I can produce steel to build these shelves here in Europe? So chip production in Europe, I think chip production is completely fully automated. Does it really matter where this factory is located? In Europe, in Poland, in Japan? So why is it that we produce chips in Asia, and why haven't we started producing them in Europe already? Well, I think it is because we failed to see the right time, and we failed to think about how we can sort of separate the supply chain to different markets. Well, I think some businesses have decided to have their chip production in Europe. My former supplier has done that, for example. They have a new supply chain here that they've created in Europe, and I think that was a great decision. I think the big obstacle is investment here.
So we are at the point where we are saying we have to invest. Everybody is forced to invest. This is an example that of a regional decision. But recently, I spoke with one of the important actors in the automotive industry, not the biggest, but this person who's in charge of logistics told me that right now they are rethinking their completely their globalization strategy, and they were looking at relocation approaches and dialing back on globalization and at least parts of their production. Well, of course, it depends on the parts, it depends on the product, and of course, it depends on the prices. I don't know a lot about microchips. The BMW has said they had 70 to 90,000 cars they could have sold if they'd had the microchips. Everybody's on short work, etc. Everything is that's all correct. But when we look at the cost, we look at the investments, particularly in the long term, we also have to consider that during Corona, there were a lot of disruptions in the supply chains. There were no ventilators and no masks, and 3 months later, everything was there. But when we look about ventilators coming from Eastern Europe or Germany, then the fact that they're 50 to 100 euros more expensive compared to Asia, well, where exactly am I going to buy these? This is exactly the same for trips. I'm going to remain with my German or European supplier, or am I going to look to Asia? We have comparative figures when it comes to production. Let us take the example of bikes, Cambodia and Bangladesh. Here, there are also possibilities of saying here in Poland, we can produce in Poland, but we have to automate a great deal. This is an work-intensive product, and we would have to increase our staff by about 4 to 5 times the figures. And if you look at e-bikes, the fact that they're costing 3 to 4,000 euros, and where exactly we headed here. So we have to take what decisions we're making. When we're assembling bikes in Poland, doesn't mean that I might perhaps get the gear shifts from Asia because I have a bottleneck there, or perhaps I don't have enough brake pads. But here there might be bottlenecks, and we may be faced with these problems. Well, we have to look at what the government policies regarding minimum wages are doing. When we don't have the goods, well, we may be looking at globalizing our high wage costs, and this, of course, we have the best logistics as well. We have the third largest industry here, and the most important job for me in all of these areas is here logistics. We know that we have the beating heart of the body, which of course supplies the body with blood, but we have logistics, which supplies all of our industries with goods. But I think we don't have enough understanding here. I work with logistics in many areas, and all of my friends, many are not familiar with all of the details, and people don't understand how complex this is. And I think we have to look at what exactly we're headed. What do we want to achieve? Well, we're in a global competitive environment. Yes, I know that. And I think that we all have to tell our people who are involved in logistics, we have to look at total customer ownership, how to take these procurement decisions. We have to sit at the table as equals. When purchasing agreements and decisions are being made, are we taking everything into consideration? Have we considered all of the risks? Have we calculated everything, factored everything into the equation? Only in this way we'll be able to take a decision that is relevant for the company, not just purchasing or logistics, or sales. But we also have to look at cost as well and decide what is right for the company per country. Allow me to provoke you perhaps a little bit. When we look at service providers, we have to look at the tenders as well. We have online bidding, and everybody's headed to the cheapest provider. Is this the right way? Maybe we should look at price-service ratio. You have to look at what the proper calculation is, particularly if you want to advance and make progress here. But let us look at some figures. Well, we are a very small country in terms of population, but we have one of the largest trade surpluses, and we are a major export country. This means that we do not import a great deal. It means we have to invest more. So we have to take a look at exactly what products this would benefit, or where can we expand automation, where can we receive our products, where we can purchase our products, particularly with perhaps more immediate suppliers. But the global competition is not going to be in a standstill. If you look at Chinese or Asian suppliers, then they're going to be shipping these throughout the world. We have to consider whether or not we're willing to pay more in euros for our products, or maybe get a equal product, a product of equal quality from China that costs less. So maybe we need to look at the societal acceptance for this issue. When I look at the textile industry, and people, of course, want cheap goods. Are we going to stick with that approach? It's not just the fact that people want things cheap, they want it today. Of course, the last mile is important. And this is a regional approach, and maybe this doesn't go hand in hand with globalization. People not only want the cheapest product, but they want it immediately. After I got my training in the forwarding industry and my studies, I was in the textile industry. We look at Germany to Eastern Europe, we look at other finishing products, and then people moved then to Asia and Europe, and in the United States there was a lot of domestic production, and then they looked to Central America and the Caribbean, Dominican Republic, and the 1980s. Bruce Springsteen saying that they're closing down the textile mill. We're losing the jobs. The jobs are gone, and they're not coming back. These jobs are gone. They're very labor intensive. There are 2,000 workers in a factory in Bangladesh or Cambodia. They manufacture high-quality goods. You cannot do this in Eastern Europe because they don't have the personnel, the staff to do this, because they don't have the people to do that. They have moved into other industries. They don't have an interest in manufacturing textiles. So China, again, is one of the largest and most important producers in this area. One important consideration here is if China is a guiding force for our markets, for instance, in the car industry, if they are willing to disrupt these markets, for example, what are we going to do? If we aren't able to produce, say, 70 to 90,000 cars, the question is whether or not China is in control, and whether or not they could perhaps damage us in this way. Well, my first travel trip to China was in the midst of in the middle of the 90s. The president of China at the time was able to loosen up controls of the Chinese market. Hu Jintao also continued these activities, and he was considered one of the most powerful men in the world at the time by forums. Xi Jinping seems to be favoring more the nationalistic approach, but others have done this as well. Our Western partners in the United States, for example, America First under Trump. And Biden is also continuing these policies. Of course, he's couching these in different terms, but Xi Jinping, of course, is favoring the Chinese approach. We also have to look at whether or not China, yes or no, but we are very important trade partners of China. Of course, they're our customers, not only our suppliers. So the question is, where are they positioned? So where does securing the market stop, and where does protectionism begin? Of course, this is a balancing act that we have to strike. What products would you like to relocate to Europe? What kind of production do you think would be best in Europe? Well, I think there are various industries that produce important components where we have the raw materials, not necessarily in Germany, but perhaps in Europe, where every industry can decide for themselves. Steel, of course, is a different issue compared to microchips. All of these are issues where we have a long supply times. All of these orders take at least 12 months to be filled, but you have to look at the idea of partnership. Partnership is very important in logistics. So the question is, of course, depends on what industry you're in. But you're saying at the same time, but the problem is that the market will forget, and we will perhaps build up something in Europe, and maybe in a few years they'll be able to purchase something cheaper. And the next ships will be here on the market in the end of 2022. Maybe we'll be able to regulate this, but we're looking at enormous sums of money. So I think all of this will maybe get back on track. But we have to have reasonable planning, and you have to think more long-term when it comes to strategic partnerships over 5 to 10 years. I can't just say I'm going to get married now, and I'm going to be married only for 1 year. Maybe that's possible, Harry, but it doesn't mean that everybody's happy. But we're talking about process integration. This is not one of the hypotheses that I wanted to introduce today, but you've touched on this a number of times here. What do I put in my call for tenders, and how can I integrate the partners when it comes to process integration, particularly over a period of years when it comes to transparency? How can we work together to optimize our processes and set common objectives that lead us to the best result that not only are rooted in the price of materials, but also end-to-end in the chain when we're talking about the port in Hamburg, the one that's behind me. So we all have to generate this understanding, but we can only do this when we work together. We need a collaborative understanding. We need to, as I said, work together. So how can we optimize these? We can only do this when we have a transparency throughout the supply chain. So you are at the source, an estimate. How many companies are truly transparent or have transparency about end-to-end supply chains when we're talking about costs, production, and waste? Just an estimate. Well, we are in the process of rebuilding our supply chains after the adoption of our recent law. So what about the transparency? So I think there are very few companies in Germany have this amount of transparency. We talked about perhaps a bid costing €5 more, and then of course you're out. How much would transparency in the end-to-end supply chain cost more? Maybe I would pay a little bit more on one end so that I would be able to assure transparency. How many companies have this transparency? I think there's a very small number. But I think that's a decisive point here. You have to trust your partners so that together with your partners, you'll be able to build this confidence through the KPIs and through transparency. For me, this is how we can sustainably develop our SMEs through partnership. We have had our longest customer for 75 years. We can only do this if it's based on trust. And this means not trying to pull the wool over their eyes, but you can only do this with trust. So we said that a minute. We talked about a concentration of suppliers, concentrate on fewer partners, and you can use a collaborative approach here. But the Chinese are saying we're the ones being blamed because we cannot offer any supply, but many of our customers have relied on China instead of broadening their scope and looking at a wider range of products that they can purchase. There's an important issue that we have not talked about, dual sourcing, perhaps the willingness within the chain. It's not just about us and our suppliers, but also our customers, wherever they may be. And we have to act in a trustworthy manner for them. We have to be open with them. Perhaps this might be a solution. I have a regional and a global partner, China or wherever. Here I can be more flexible. And maybe I would be able to cushion these effects if unexpected events occur. I think this is an important issue we can examine. In the past, this was not our focus to a great extent. Trust is something that you've said. It's not bullshit bingo, of course. It's not what I want to say, but trust is a component in every contract that we conclude. Trust needs facts, hard facts, in fact, and we also need the will to innovate. Chris, can we do this with automation, with technologies, with AI, with digitalization? Can we compensate for the higher costs through a production site, perhaps in Europe? And perhaps we can improve our costs vis-a-vis Taiwan, China, or other international partners. We have to imagine that there are a number of levers here in our process costs, end to end. You still have an Excel sheet, you have 100 emails that have to be written, you still have a number of silos that you're working with, you have suppliers, and how are you going to talk to my producers, how to talk to my customers, etc. And this has to be tackled. You have to share data so that everybody has the information that is being entered and can be accessed easily. So this is how you create a transparency. Digitalization will only help us in combating process costs if we work in partnership. But only to a certain degree. But only if we continue to pursue this into the future, and I think that we have to do this. Either we're going to close our doors, and that's not a solution. So we have to make the best of the situation. And this is the best part of entrepreneurship. You can continue to tap the potential that is still there. So these are the opportunities that we see in logistics. And we have built on over the last 10 years. So when you look at the KPIs, that's important, but you have to look at the issue end to end. I think that is an important view. So we have to look at targeted commodities, specific products, so there we can create transparency. But it's very difficult to remain control over the entire process as a company. What about the procurement markets? What is the most important component to be successful in making the right decisions? What advice would you give entrepreneurs and companies? I think transparency on data. So I think this is my main issue here. You need to have facts in hand to make a decision. You need to have a gut feeling. You also have to consider innovation and where you're going to invest your money, but you have to have hard facts and partnerships, and this is what is going to help us make progress. And I see this in our daily discussions with suppliers. If we're not open with each other, then at some point down the road, the evidence will be there that things aren't as they should be. Now that everybody is only thinking until tomorrow, we have to say, hey, we have to look beyond tomorrow to 2022, 2023, but we have to be able to look at both levels, both in the short to medium and the longer term. Particularly if you don't want the company to falter. What about you? I think transparency definitely, particularly vis-a-vis our customers. This is all true for bikes, toys, textiles, etc. The Uyghurs in China, of course, is a major issue. when cotton is grown in the Uyghur region, then products should not be using that. What about the problem is you have the dyers, you have the weavers, you have etc. You have raw materials and products, you have the laundries, etc. This is an entire area. But logistics is a part of the supply chain. And it's also subject to self-assessment. So code of conduct is important for my customers, and this is something I have to uphold as well. And you can only do this if you rely on transparency. These Excel sheets and emails have to be made a thing of the past. It can only happen if we are digitally organized. Networks with our customers, we have to involve our customers into logistics chain earlier on. Contractual logistics is very simple. We only need the merchandise that the customers have ordered, and we have to sequence all of the upstream process. If goods are not here, we can't really do anything about that. If the refrigerator is empty at home, then I can't get a drink of milk. So you have to look at supermarkets, you have to look at your orders and make sure that the goods are on the shelves. This is logistics writ large. So, in conclusion, my question is, would you be prepared to pay 50% more for your goods, T-shirts, cars, etc., if they were produced in euro? For a T-shirt, yes, but for a car, no. Ralf, well, I can't really answer that. I have to take a look at our customers. No, you, personally. Yes, I know, but I think we have to look at the big picture. No, we have customers who have to rely on cheap production because their customers are interested in that. I have, of course, a different situation in my wallet, perhaps, as Ralf Düster. Yes, me, yes, maybe 50% more for a car. But of course, it depends on which car you would be willing to pay more for. Do you think the majority of Germans would agree with you, would be willing to do that? No, I don't think so. Unfortunately not. And that is exactly the point. And this is why we are here talking about this issue. So I was afraid of that. This brings me to the end of our discussion. Thank you very much for all of your hypotheses and your ideas. And thank you very much for being here with us today. So globalization, this was my conclusion. I think there's no alternative. This is what we talked about. It's not just a question of if, but it's actually a question of how. So I'd like to thank all of you very much for your ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, please join us at 3 p.m. this afternoon. So we're going to be talking about environmental issues. What about greenhouse gas emissions and other equipment? You will be able to see these talks at the website www.still.de. We'd like to welcome you back next time.